In a world where justice is supposed to be impartial, it is a painful reality that innocent individuals can end up being imprisoned. But what happens when these mistakes are corrected and the wrongfully convicted are finally set free? We will examine the uplifting accounts of wrongfully convicted people who were released. These stories will leave you astounded, encouraged, and ultimately filled with hope. From the decade-long fights for their innocence to their eventual exoneration and release from prison. Join us as we delve into the lives of these remarkable people and learn how they found the courage to persevere in the face of injustice. Anthony Ray Hinton. Anthony Ray Hinton was falsely accused of two different murders that occurred during a string of robberies in Alabama in 1985. Although he had a strong alibi for one of the murders, Hinton was arrested, charged, and convicted of both crimes based solely on the testimony of a state ballistics expert who claimed that a gun found in Hinton's mother's home matched the bullets found at the crime scenes. Hinton was ultimately sentenced to death and spent 3 decades on death row, most of it in solitary confinement. Despite this ordeal, he maintained his innocence and continued to appeal his case. In 2014, the US Supreme Court agreed to hear his case and ruled that Hinton had been denied his constitutional right to a fair trial due to his inadequate legal representation and the use of unreliable forensic evidence. Hinton was subsequently released from prison in April 2015 at the age of 58. Since his release, Hinton has become a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform and the abolition of the death penalty. He has also written a memoir, The Sun Does Shine: How I Found Life and Freedom of Death Row, which details his harrowing experience and the personal growth he underwent during his decades in prison. Ray Ferguson. Ray Ferguson was accused and convicted of the 2001 murder of Kent Highholt, a newspaper editor in Missouri. Ferguson was a teenager at the time of the murder and professed his innocence from the outset. Based on the testimony of the 2 witnesses, including a friend who claimed to have seen Ferguson at the scene of the crime, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Over time, doubts began to emerge about the case against Ferguson. Both the witnesses who testified against him later recanted their statements, claiming that they had been coerced by the police. Additionally, no physical evidence linked Ferguson to the crime. After years of legal wrangling, Ferguson's case received renewed attention in 2013 when an appeals court judge overturned his conviction, citing clear and convincing evidence of his innocence. The court discovered that the prosecutor in the case had concealed critical evidence from Ferguson's defense team, including witnesses' statements that could have exonerated him. Ferguson was released from prison later that year, having served nearly a decade behind bars. He has since become an advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking out about the flaws in the legal system that resulted in an innocent person's wrongful conviction and incarceration. The Central Park Five. The Central Park Five refers to a group of 5 Black and Latino teenagers who were accused and convicted of the rape and assault of a white woman in New York City's Central Park in 1989. The highly publicized case was rife with racial tension, with many individuals calling for the accused to receive the death penalty. Despite the absence of physical evidence linking the teenagers to the crime, they were coerced into providing false confessions by law enforcement and prosecutors, resulting in convictions and prison sentences ranging from 6 to 13 years. In 2002, the DNA evidence surfaced that pointed to Matthias Rice as the perpetrator of the crime. Rice had confessed to the crime and his DNA was found to match the evidence collected from the victim. The convictions of the Central Park Five were vacated and they were freed from prison. The case has since been emblematic of the inequities of the criminal justice system, particularly regarding people of color and the need of enhanced protection for defendants during interrogations. A Netflix miniseries, When They See Us, has contributed to the renewed attention to the case and the issue of systematic racism in the criminal justice system. David Ranta. David Ranta is a man who was wrongly convicted of murder in 1991 in Brooklyn, New York City. He was accused of killing Robbie Haskell Westberger during a robbery gone wrong. Despite the lack of physical evidence implicating him in the crime, he was convicted based on the testimony of witnesses who later recanted their statements. He was sentenced to 37.5 years in prison. However, in 2013, after serving 23 years in jail, Ranta was released when it was discovered that crucial evidence in his case had been fabricated. A witness admitted that a detective had coached him to identify Ranta in a police lineup even though he did not recognize him. Additionally, evidence that could have exonerated Ranta, including the fact that another man had confessed to the crime, was withheld by the prosecution. Ranta filed a lawsuit against the city of New York and the NYPD for police misconduct and negligence, and in 2014 he was granted a $6.4 million settlement. The case is an example of the flaws in the criminal justice system, particularly the problem of wrongful convictions and the need for better protections for defendants. Jonathan Fleeman. Jonathan Fleeman is a man who was wrongfully convicted of murder and spent 24 years in prison before being exonerated and released in 2014. Fleeman was convicted in 1989 for the murder of Daryl Rush, a drug dealer who was shot in Brooklyn, New York. Fleeman was accused of traveling from his home in Florida to New York to commit the murder, even though he had evidence that he was in Florida at the time. Fleeman always maintained his innocence and had an alibi witness who testified that he was with him in Florida at the time of murder. However, this witness was never presented in court and the prosecution relied on a testimony from a sole eyewitness who later recanted his statement, saying that he was coerced into identifying Fleeman as the shooter by police. Despite this, Fleeman's appeals were denied and he remained in prison for over 2 decades. However, in 2010, his case was taken up by the Innocence Project, a non-profit legal organization that works to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals through DNA testing and other means. In 2014, a judge overturned Fleeman's conviction and he was released from prison after spending 24 years behind bars. The judge cited overwhelming proof of Fleeman's innocence and the extensive and convincing evidence presented by the Innocence Project and the Conviction Review Unit. Fleeman's case has been cited as an example of the flaws in the criminal justice system and the need for better protections for defendants, particularly in cases where the evidence is circumstantial and relies on eyewitness testimony. The case also highlights the important work of organizations like the Innocence Project, which have worked to exonerate over 375 wrongfully convicted individuals in the United States.